Jenny, coach and NLP practitioner, helping people live a bigger life, helping introverts beat fear and self-doubt, helping people have more confidence in the way they communicate so they can get what they really want out of life. I was at an old friend's wedding yesterday. She's not that old, but we've known each other for 32 years, so we really felt it yesterday when we were talking about that. And she was getting married, and it was just such a wonderful day. And one part of the reason it was so wonderful is that the pair of us have gone through so much stuff over the last several years, and we've really worked on ourselves. And it's one of those things that my clients come to me and they go, help, I'm in a new relationship and I don't know what to do, or I want a new relationship and I don't know what to do. And we both met our partners online. So it's a whole new ball game of how we go dating today. And I was talking to her mum and she asked me how I met Matt. And I said online, she went, I don't know why I even bother asking anymore. So I was thinking about this, and I've been thinking about it for the last week, but it really was kind of highlighted yesterday in this wedding, how scary it can be when you start a new relationship, especially when you've been with someone else for so long. And even though that relationship can be very, very difficult, and what you're going to is ultimately better, you get used to being in that old way of things, and it takes quite a lot of work to get out of it. So when I decided to look online for a new partner, I wanted to make sure I didn't make the same mistakes again. I wanted to really dig deep and see where I had gone wrong in those relationships. There's no point in blaming the other person. It feels good for a while. It's nice, isn't it, to have a good moan and pretend that it's all the other person's fault. But I know that I enabled a lot of the behaviour that went on in the relationship. I know that I contributed to a lot of the behaviour that went on in the relationship, in both that one and my marriage, and I didn't want to do that again. So I had to look inside myself and acknowledge the part I played in order to create a better relationship moving forward. And I had to work on me, which is really scary. You know, it's scary working on yourself. What if you work on yourself and you find out that you really are that person that you hope you're not? What happens if you really can't change, or if you discover that you don't like yourself, or that all of those things that you think about yourself in your head are actually true? And if you have to remove the mask you've been wearing and others don't like what they see, so it might not even be that we don't like what we see, but what if we remove this mask and other people don't like what they see? And what if you can't find the person to have the sort of relationship that you want to have? What if they're not there? What if they're just like a checklist that's impossible to fulfill? So all these things were going through my head when I decided to go online to look for a new partner. And I know many of my friends who've done the same thing had exactly the same thoughts. And it is really scary. But I know lots of people now who have gone through that process and found their forever person. And so I want to share with you a bit of what goes on. So working on yourself is one of the hardest things you can do, but also the most rewarding. And when I made the decision to go online to find my perfect match, I did it consciously and with intent. And I knew what I wanted because I also knew what I didn't want. And I knew what I wasn't willing to tolerate anymore. And I'd been tolerating for an awful long time. And so have my partners. So it wasn't just me, it wasn't just one-sided. And we have to always look at this isn't one-sided. So the other person was equally tolerating stuff from me. But I knew that I didn't want that anymore. And what if I'd made a big mistake and this person really wasn't out there? But I knew they were. I just knew that they were. I'd invested in myself. I'd worked out my past. I'd worked out what I'd done. I had therapy. did a relationship course. And I knew where I wanted to be in the future. And so what did I do on my first date? And this is one of the things I think most people struggle with, particularly introverts, is that what do you talk about on your first date? Well, I turned up my first date with 3 A4 sheets of paper and they had 30 questions on them. And when I tell this story, people, honestly, they look at me like I've totally lost the plot. And they think Matt was a complete saint for even sticking around for the first bit of the date. But here's the thing. On that date, we had answered all of the big stuff. All of the things that you get too scared to ask. You know, when it's either too early, is it too early? I really want to know that was too early. Like, I can't ask about marriage on the first date or the second date or the third date. And then you get to 6 months down the line and it's like, oh, well, I can't ask it now. Like, it's too weird to ask it now. And then what if they say no and I've just lost the last 6 months and I can't risk that? And so we stay in a lot of situations that we don't want to be in because we can't risk asking those really difficult questions. And I found that asking them right at the beginning meant that they were out of the way and I knew exactly what was going on. And could the answer have been something that I didn't want to hear? Of course it could, absolutely. That's the point. I could have then moved on very quickly if that had been the case, or I could have had the knowledge to work out what I wanted to do about it. And I'm not talking about the things like he doesn't like ketchup, which is just weird. Like, seriously, it's weird. But Matt does not like ketchup. I find it very strange. But not those type of things. It's the really big stuff. So here are some of the top questions that I asked on that date. And these came from the relationship course that I did. So they were not my questions, but they weren't also the Google questions that you Google saying, 30 best questions to ask on a first date. They weren't those sorts of questions. So here were my top questions. First one, what books and podcasts are in the list? So if you can see what books they listen to, what podcasts they like, you can get a real feel for the person and what they're interested in. If you don't like sport and all of their list is sporting things, then you might be okay with that. But it might also be a bit of a, that's not really my thing. How are we going to move forward with this? We both had very similar tastes in a lot of things. So we both had personal development stuff. We had similar books in our list. So that was a great way of finding out a bit more about each other very, very easily. The next question, what do you define as an ideal relationship? And this is a really big one. This is actually one of the questions we were told to ask before the first date. So I already had the answer to this question. I knew what the answer was. What qualities do you want most in your partner? So again, this is a really big question. What qualities do you want your partner to have? Ask them. Because if they're qualities that you don't have, you have to be honest and upfront and say, well, actually, it's something I'm working on, or I don't have the same values, because then you're learning about each other's values and your beliefs, and you might have religious values, you might have those sorts of things, and they might not be there for you, and it's better to find out really early on. What are your non-negotiables? So my non-negotiable was smoking, and Matt was very upfront and honest with me that he had been stopping smoking for a while and he was still using smoking aids, but if that wasn't okay with me, he was willing to step back. And I really had to think hard about it as to whether that was something that I wanted to deal with at all. And I decided that was not one of my non-negotiables. And why would you turn someone down when they had literally run the whole marathon, just not got to the last 2 miles? So and now sure enough, he has stopped those things, so he's been successful. And if I had just knocked that dead at the time and not had the conversation or the thought going on, then I could have stopped that relationship from happening. But at the same time, I had to work out where my boundaries were. What did you learn from your past relationships? This is a really good one to highlight how they feel about things, because relationships never end because they're just one-sided. So really look out for if it's all negative, or if there's a lot of I did nothing wrongs going on. And that leads on to the next question of what part did you play in your last relationship ending? And what would you do differently? So listen really carefully to the answers, because you can learn a lot about somebody from how reflective they are about themselves. What are your biggest fears in relationships? And again, this is a big question for a first or second date, or very early. And I would recommend you ask these really early on, because talking about fears is something that we hide from people. We hide our fears quite early on, but If you know what they fear in a relationship, you can then see where they're at and what issues might come up along the way and how you can communicate better to deal with those things. And the last one that I'm going to talk about today, and there were 30 questions, so this is just a sample of them, is how much quality time do you need with your partner versus how much time do you need on your own? And that is a really important question because particularly for introverts need time on their own to regroup, re-energize. And on their own might mean, like for me, on my own is me with my partner. So that's me on my own. I'm quite happy with me and my partner together re-energizing. But for your partner, it might be they have to be completely on their own for one day a week. They might need that space. And so it's really good. Some partners might say, well, I need 3 days on my own. That might be absolutely fine for you, but it might not be fine. And if it's not fine, don't pretend it's not happening. Don't hope they will change. Don't hope that it will be different. You then have to acknowledge that and go, okay, well, I either have to be okay with this, or I have to find a way for me to be okay with it, or this just isn't the relationship for me. And this might sound really tough, and things do change as we go along. And I'm not saying any of this is black and white. It is not. But it's a really good basis for starting open conversations, because if you don't ask that question and a month or 2 months down the line, you're going, well, he only wants to see me 2 nights a week, which is what happened in my past relationship. And it drove me nuts. I hated it. I absolutely hated it. I felt undervalued. I felt like they didn't want to be with me. We'd never had the conversation of how many nights do you need on your own. And I could have made those decisions about the relationship based on that conversation, instead of constantly thinking they didn't want to be with me. And they had better things to do, which in honesty, I think they did have better things to do in their mind. So it's a good question to ask straight up, because then there is no confusion. You can make some really good decisions in advance, but don't just knock people off the list just because of those things. There might be other things that you can have a conversation about. So they're good conversation starters. They're good ways of finding out about somebody. Okay, so we just acknowledged that this is a lot of ground to cover on a first or second date, and especially for introverts, but it does set the groundwork for how we could build the relationship without games and second guessing. And as soon as we did all of this, the pressure just left us. There's no 3 months down the line wondering about marriage, wondering about whether we wanted children, all of those kind of things. The questions were answered up front. And there was no room for false expectations and disappointment, which often comes when you're starting a relationship and you think you're going down one road, and then the partner goes, oh, no, that wasn't in my mind. That wasn't what I thought a relationship was. That wasn't what I thought we were doing. Lay your cards out on the table. It doesn't matter if it's disappointing in that moment, if it's the wrong answer or the not one that doesn't suit you, but it saves you a lot of time. And time is the most precious thing we have. And when I look back at my 4-year relationship, I think, gosh, I could have saved so much time for myself. So it's not about regrets. It's just about learning how we can do things differently. So we did the same questions a year later, actually, and many of the answers had changed, and changed a lot in some of the cases. So it's a great way to see also how you evolve as individuals, not just as a couple. So if you ask the questions at the beginning of the relationship and then ask at certain periods, you can see how things are changing. So this is where I say, don't knock anyone off the list just because they don't give absolutely the answer that you were looking for, because they can change and you can get different insights and learnings about each other, which will completely change how you feel about those questions. But don't expect people to change, and don't think, well, I didn't like the answer, but I'm going to make them change, because that doesn't work. And it's the same for yourself as well. So you don't want that for yourself. So you also need to be able to answer these questions. It's a two-way street. And when I think back to past relationships, I can feel that internal conflict that I had over and over again of, do I say what I'm thinking? What if he doesn't like it? What if I cause an argument? And I would sometimes spend whole days with these things going around and around and around in my head. And I wouldn't say anything and I wouldn't say anything, and I would boil and I would start to boil inside because I needed an answer to these questions, and I sort of knew the answer wasn't what I wanted to hear. And I would just like stew away all day. And then at some point within the day, I go, I couldn't hold it in any longer. I had to ask the questions. And at that point, there would often be an argument because there was a whole host of issues with it. But I would be disappointed and they would be confused because I'd been storing this up for ages and ages and ages. And it's such a waste of energy. And all of a sudden, my energy would just go, woo. And they would go, oh, where did that come from? How many of you do that? Like, I think it happens a lot in relationships where we don't say things. We hold back and we hold back because we don't want to upset the other person. We don't want to come across as needy, or we don't want to be seen as being difficult. And then we have to say something at some point. And at that point, it just goes a bit kaboomish. And the other person's left thinking, what on earth happened there? So when we can get all these cards on the table and not play games, it's really, really helpful. One of the things that I'm sure you want to know is, how can you make sure that you have these open communications right from the beginning of your relationship so that you have what you want from your relationship? And how can you go about doing that? And for me, I've talked a lot about asking questions. I love asking questions. I'm a coach. It's my job. But I found it interesting when I asked my last partner a question, and he said, why do you ask such difficult questions all the time? Why are you always asking questions? Now, the question I'd asked him was, what exactly was it about me that he loved? And apparently that was a really difficult question for him to answer, and it was an awkward question. And at that point, I knew that there wasn't much further we could go with that relationship. And it didn't last very much longer than that, maybe a week or two. But to me, asking questions is essential to communication. It's how I get through every single difficult moment that we have in my current relationship. And there's not that many because we sort them all out in advance. And the difficult moments aren't usually between the two of us. But if we don't ask questions, we find ourselves guessing. And we're rubbish at guessing. I've learned this from my clients and from myself, that we are rubbish at guessing the answer to questions we've got going on in our heads. It's much, much better to ask them. So here are the other tips. You have to listen to the answer. I was never very good at this actually in previous relationships. It wasn't the answers that I wanted, so I would kind of block them out and forget them, and I didn't hear what they had to say before I would bite. And it's just something that came instinctively for me, that I would have to put myself there first so that I didn't listen to the real answer, because I didn't want the real answer. And we have to learn to take on board, hear, listen, and want the actual, genuine, real answer. And sometimes when I forget now to do that, because it's a process for us all, when I forget to listen, and it's pointed out to me that I'm not listening, it doesn't make me cross anymore. It used to make me cross. And now it doesn't make me cross, because I think to myself, yeah, I agreed to do that listening and I'm not doing it. I agreed to that. And this has to be a two-way street again. So it's not about you doing all the listening. Both partners have to do equal listening, and just sit back, and you can remind each other. And if you're in a good, secure relationship, and I know I'm talking right at the beginning of the relationship, but if we start how we mean to go on, it builds a brilliant foundation for none of the nonsense that comes on later of why you're asking all these awkward questions. If you start off straight away, if they don't like it, it's okay, because they can go and find somebody that doesn't ask the questions, and they can go and find somebody who guesses what the answers are, and that is not the relationship that's going to get them very far. So when you're putting your viewpoint forward, here's another one. I want you to let it know that it's just your opinion. You're not necessarily correct, but you need to be heard. And this is another thing that's really important, is that we're not always correct. And acknowledging that we're not always correct is a really positive thing to do. Because when we acknowledge that we're not always correct, the other person will start to listen to us. But we also have to be heard. And that's when I say it's a two-way street. Allowing yourself to be heard right from the beginning of a relationship, right at the start. It builds such a great foundation, I promise you. And I know it's difficult, especially, actually, it's not an introvert extrovert thing. Introverts will find it difficult in the way that it's just having a conversation, and sometimes that can be difficult. First dates can be difficult, but once they get to the first dates, if you've got a list of structured questions, then that's actually easier. And Matt is a real introvert. He loved the fact that I had questions. He didn't have to think of stuff, so it was really good. But also it can be difficult for extroverts too, because they have to be structured and they have to listen, and it has to be the two-way street. So they'd probably be okay with answering some of the questions, but maybe not the listening part. So it's a really good exercise to learn how to communicate together. And I'm sure you all want to know how I felt once I had looked at myself, and was it as scary as I thought? And it wasn't at all, actually. It was a real release for me. Every time I've done coaching, every time I've done therapy, and I come away and I think, okay, I've made mistakes in the past, but for the first time, and it happens every time I do this, I can forgive myself for those things. I can not hold on to them. And that's been really, really empowering. Being able to forgive yourself for mistakes you've made in the past is massively powerful. And I learned how much I've grown in the last 5 years. Also, seeing where I've been and where I've got to has been an amazing process. And I always acknowledge that I've still got a lot of growing to do, and that's possible because I've already done it. So I've done the growth to here and I've got the growth to there, but because I've done it to here, it's possible. So when we grow in coaching and anything that we do in life, it shows us that there is a possibility of future growth because we've done it once, right? If we've done it once, we can definitely do it again. We grow every single day of our lives. And we have a choice of whether it's a conscious or a subconscious growth. So I know which one works for me. Conscious growth, choosing what direction I grow in, what direction I go in, that's what works for me. If you want to choose unconscious growth and just go along with whatever happens in life, then that's great too. If that works for you, then that's brilliant. For me, it's about, this is where I'm going, this is my target, this is where I want to get to. And if I deviate along the way because I've grown and I've learned and it's changed, then that's fine. But I like to have a bit of a plan of action for where I'm going to go forward, which is how I started my current relationship. I had a plan, I had a structure, I had things in place, and those people that look at me like I'm completely crazy because I turned up on a first date with 30 questions, I've got exactly what I looked for. A person who didn't run away and shy away from those really, really, really difficult questions. So if you're excited about starting a new relationship, or you're absolutely terrified of starting a new relationship and you don't know where to start and you don't know how to communicate, I love helping people with communication. And whether that relationship is with a new partner or whether it's with your children, your parents, it doesn't matter who it's with, whether it's with a partner you've been with for 20 years. I love working with people on how to communicate better because I've learned so much from learning how to communicate better. So it's great for me to see people in new relationships and friendships and having that flourish and grow and thrive, not just survive. So if you'd like to hear more of all the things I do, remember to hit the subscribe and notification bells, all of those things that we like you to press, please press them and leave some comments. Tell me what you think. Try and be kind. I like to be kind. Don't be too cruel, but I'd love to hear in the comments what you think, what your thoughts are about new relationships and how you feel about this quite detailed process of starting a new relationship with lots and lots of deep questions.